cloud, or they're recording here. There we go. Now we know that we're recording here. And as people come, I'll just let them in. And so we are now live, both on Zoom and Facebook Live. Welcome everybody to the second to the last installment of our May is for Mystery Month. We have one more coming up on Saturday. And tonight we have, I'd like to welcome Maureen Milliken. She's a longtime New England journalist whose mystery fiction draws from her years in the newsroom, as well as her love of her home state of Maine. The
That's
Bernie
right.
O'Day Mystery Series. Bernie O'Day Mystery Series is set in a weekly newspaper in Franklin County, Maine. The series includes debut Cold Hard News, which was out in 2015. No News is Bad News in 2016, and Bad News Travels Fast in 2018. All of Maureen's books can be found, signed copies of the books can be found at our store and online through our website, freethinkerscorner.com/browse, and just type in Maureen Milliken or Cold Hard News, one of the book titles, and it'll bring you right to it. Maureen, welcome to a Free Thinkers Corner May is for Mystery Writer series.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. And I'm a big supporter of booksellers. Even if I weren't a writer, my mom was a bookseller for many years at the legendary Maine chain Mr. Paperback. And so I'm really happy you're doing the series. I think it's great.
Thanks. You said you live in Maine. You're a journalist. Are you still a journalist, or?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I work for a business publication. I kind of ramping things down a little. The daily newspaper grind isn't as fun as it used to be. And my dream would be to write mysteries full time, but gotta pay the mortgage. So
how did you get your start in journalism?
Well, I'm actually a third generation journalist. My grandfather, on my dad's side, was a newspaper editor, and as was my dad. So I grew up kind of steeped in it. And I don't ever remember not wanting to be one. I think maybe part of it is my personality is geared toward it. I'm very nosy, curious, I guess would be the more polite way to say it, but nosy. And I always like to tell people what's going on. And I have a lot of appreciation for the written word. And I also always wanted to be a mystery writer. So those are two things that I had wanted to do for as long as I can remember, and ended up doing them. I think one thing about journalism that I found appealing was I knew growing up that it would be something different every day, that there'd be, there's kind of drudgery to it. Having a dad who was a newspaper editor, I knew kind of everything that was involved. And he used to take us, one of my earliest memories is of him taking my sister, who's a year older, and I to a car accident on the end of our street. I was probably 2 or 3 years old. And he used to take us to, sometimes I can remember some big fires we went to. And so I think I had an interest in that type of thing. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's fun to do it for a living.
What was your first published story?
Wow. As a journalist,
yeah,
I would have to say it was as a full-time journalist, I had an internship at the Portland Press Herald in the summer of 1982. And honestly, I can't remember what my stories were, but my first full-time job was at the Biddeford Journal-Tribune in Biddeford, Maine, in the Sanford Bureau. And my first story there, which I still have a clipping of, was about a water treatment plant. So the glamour started right away. And I didn't do any fiction writing. I wasn't like dabbling in fiction writing. I put my dream of being a mystery writer on the shelf for a long, long time.
did you what types of stories did you like to cover? I mean, you probably what stories did you cover? What stories did you like to cover? Were you able to choose afterwards as you got a little more tenure, which ones you got to cover?
Well, everywhere I worked was different. I did what is still probably the path for journalists, but it was definitely the path back then, where you start at a very small paper, where your beat is usually a regional one. And for me, that was the Biddeford Journal Tribune, and I covered Sanford. Then I covered one summer, I covered Wells and Agunquit and Kennebunk and Kennebunkport. And so it was kind of a regional thing. I moved on to that newspaper no longer exists. I moved on after almost 2 years to the Haverhill Gazette in Haverhill, Massachusetts, which also doesn't exist. So they're kind of like dying behind me. Um, and then I was for 25 years at the New Hampshire Union Leader in Manchester. And I was, when I went there, I was a general assignment reporter working nights. So a lot of the coverage when you're a night reporter is breaking news, fires and murders, and that was my favorite type of thing to cover, when you're presented with something and you have to find out about it and write about it as fast as you can. And in the good old days, we had 4 editions, so there were 4 deadlines or more over the course of the night, and so you could keep updating the story. And it was, that you kind of get that rush of finding out what's going on, of finding a way to tell the story as fast as you can and get it out there. And it was a lot of fun. And I used to just love any kind of crime story or breaking news. I was the city hall reporter, the night city hall reporter in Manchester for a while, which meant I went to aldermen's meetings and school board meetings, which wasn't as fun. I've covered and as an editor edited a lot of like planning board meeting stories over my life, and I would not call that fun. But I do still like being able to tell a story. I think some people would think working for a business publication it would be boring, but I approach every story as though it's a story about people and what they're doing, and why they're doing it and what's becoming of it. And obviously you have to get the businessy stuff in there. But I think even when I was an obit editor for a while on and off in Manchester, because 25 years you do like every job in the newsroom. I was a sports editor for a while, but I would look at every obituary as a story. This is someone's life. This is, we may have 30 a night back in the good old days at the Union Leader, but for this person's family, this is their one. And I always found them very interesting, because you kind of try to picture the person and what their life was like from just these little tidbits in their obituary. So to me, everything was interesting. Everything I did was interesting.
So what did you do as an obit writer? Did you just kind of clean up the text, or?
Well, it's changed. It changed a lot over the years. Now, when you see them in a newspaper, they're all pretty much paid advertisements. So how the funeral home or family writes them is how they go in. Back when I first started at the Union Leader, whatever you were doing, you could be writing the page 1 story, and the funeral directors would call the obituaries in, because this was in the days before email. And we did get a fax machine, which I just thought was the most miraculous thing I'd ever seen. And you'd have to type them, but you'd sit there and take it over the phone. And there was a standard format. And once in a while, if it was a prominent person, we would break it out into a feature story. But there's kind of a standard formula to them, and and I always tried to kind of see the story behind the formula, and sometimes the funeral director, you could kind of pull, because it was usually the funeral directors calling them, and you could kind of pull some details that maybe they hadn't written down at first. And who knows if the family was happy about that or not.
So when you were young and your father was an editor, did you get to hang out and like with all the other journalists and stuff? And
Well, it was a good time. We grew up in an era where where parents kind of had, I'm not saying that they were separate from kids, but they weren't hovering over us all the time. We kind of did our thing and they did their thing. And we had a lot of gatherings at our house where people my dad worked with would come to the house and they'd sit around drinking beer and talking. And it was always very interesting to listen to. And I have a story that I think is, I'll never forget. That I was 7 or 8, and my dad and some of the people at the newspaper he worked at, we lived in Ohio at the time, were having an argument. They had a quote in the paper from, I think, a sheriff's deputy who used the word dildo. He called somebody a dildo. And I can remember being like, Dad, what's a dildo? Dad, what's a dildo? And he's ignoring me because that's what parents did back in the 60s and 70s. They didn't interrupt an adult conversation to talk to a kid. And he probably wouldn't have told me anyway. So I went and tried to look it up in the dictionary and it wasn't there. And years and years later, when I found out, I'm like, oh, okay. But so that's the kind of stuff that went on in our house. You know, it was fun to sit at the top of the stairs at night and listen to them talk and argue and talk about what was going on in the newsroom. And my dad would bring us, I have 5 siblings, and on a Saturday or whatever, he would bring us to the newsroom, not all 5 of us, but a couple of us. And we used to just run around and have a ball. There wouldn't be people there. This was in the old days when they had pots of rubber cement on the desk to paste things up, because you would type and then you would paste the typewritten pages together. And one thing we discovered with the rubber cement is you could pour it out on a desk, and when it dried, you could roll it up like this and make super balls out of it. And so it wasn't like we were learning about journalism, but it was, you know, I can still remember the smell of the ink and the paper and the presses rumbling. And it just was something that just became ingrained in me, you know, just a cultural part of my life. Yeah.
Do you think you just, because you really weren't paying attention to what was going on, you were having fun making little super balls though, but you absorbed all that and that kind of just sort of manifested itself later on in life?
Yeah, I think kids pick up a lot of what's going on around them. And I think I was a curious kid, and I think most of my siblings are too. I don't know if it has to do with how our parents raised us or just our DNA, but I found things interesting. I loved reading newspapers. I can remember my mom reading me the Sunday comics when I was very young, and me thinking, boy, I can't wait till I know how to read so I can read them myself. And I remember things like when the Kent State shooting happened. I think it was May, I can't remember the exact date, 4th or 5th or something, 1970. I had just turned 9 a few days before, and I was homesick from school. I remember I wasn't sick. I don't know why I was home. I probably didn't want to go to school that day. But I can remember the newspaper, the Dayton Daily News, on our dining room table. I can remember reading the article and even the layout with the 4 people who had died. And I just always found reading newspapers interesting and news like that very interesting. And I think it maybe goes hand in hand with being a mystery writer.
What was the most gruesome story you ever had to write?
When I was working in Manchester, there were, I want to say, I can't remember. Now this is going to show how maybe callous I am or whatever, but I can't remember anything really gruesome. I can remember going down, there was a body floating in the river, and going down to cover that and seeing they hadn't pulled him out yet, because the newspaper was still downtown and the Merrimack River went right through, and it kind of realizing, wow, that's the first time I've seen a dead body floating in a river or otherwise, and it kind of stayed with me. And I'm not saying I didn't feel bad, but like part of me felt bad and part of me thought it was interesting. There was a another thing, it wasn't really gruesome, but I guess it kind of shows how naive I was. There had been a sniper situation where somebody was shooting at people coming out of a restaurant on the outskirts of Manchester, and they had it on the TV station, Channel 9. And so the night editor, Harry Von Haslen, told me and Rob Percy, who sometimes he was a reporter but also took pictures, to go see what was going on. And by the time we got to the area, the police had blocked the road off. But my cousin at the time lived nearby, and I knew if we went to her house, we could go through the woods and kind of come up behind where this was. So we did that, and we came up behind somebody's yard, and we could see in the house. It was maybe about this time of night, and you could still see, and you could see in the house, there was a guy in there talking on the phone, and he kind of came out and walked around his back deck talking on his phone and going in. So we're like, probably me was like, I think Rob was like, okay, this is a dangerous situation. Let's not do anything. But I'm like, we can go in that guy's house and we'll be able to see the restaurant. So we went in and we said to the guy, can we come in and see what's going on? And he's like, sure. And he started telling me how he had been a sniper in the Army. And there's this military uniform hanging up on a wall, and we're all looking out and figuring out what's going on. These were the old days when you had to call the paper. So I called the boss and told him what was going on. And I think Rob took some pictures and went. And I went outside and started talking to neighbors once the scene had been cleared. And when I got to work, and I wrote a story up, and when I got to work the next afternoon, the city editor, Don Anderson, said, oh, they arrested somebody for that sniper thing. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And he goes, well, here's his mugshot. And I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody listening to the story that it was the guy whose house we were in.
Oh, jeez.
and I'm like, duh. But so I guess I wasn't as savvy. I would have been about 25 then, and I guess I wasn't as savvy as I thought I was. But a lesson learned.
Did you always have a photographer go with you on stories, or did you take your own pictures sometimes, or you didn't do any pictures at all?
When I first started in Biddeford, we had to bring a camera because most newspapers, and it's true today, you know, they'd have more reporters than photographers. And so I learned I had a little Pentax 350 that I would use, and it's funny now with my job now, I also take pictures and I bring a digital camera. I don't use my phone most of the time, but of course we were never as good as the professional photographers. And one thing I learned, and I cringe when I hear somebody on TV say this or whatever, one thing I learned very early on is you don't call the photographer my photographer. He or she is not your photographer. Like the reporter, oh, here's my photographer, Bob Lepre. No, he's not my photographer. And it may have been Bob Lepre, who was a legendary photographer for the Union Leader, and just really a good journalist and great. He may have been the first one who said to me, I'm not your photographer. I'm the newspaper's photographer. Like, you're the newspaper's reporter. And I'm like, oh, yeah. But sometimes you would travel together with a photographer, but especially in the old days, they had to take their photos and get back to get the film developed. So, and we would stay at the scene of whatever it was. And we had a special number we could call, but you'd have to find a payphone, or, and this would never happen these days, knock on someone's door and say, I'm the reporter from the Union Leader and I'm covering the fire across the street. Can I use your phone to call the story in? And back then people would say, sure. In fact, one of my big memories is New Year's Eve, I want to say 1987, there was a fire, and me and Paula Tracy, another reporter who is my age, were sent to it, and there was like this freezing rain and everything. And we got there, and one of the firemen said to us, that guy over there is a hero. There was a kid in the house, and he ran down with her to the fire station. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to go talk to him. And one of the cops said to me, no, you can't talk to him. And I'm like, what? That's not right. Usually they want you to, somebody did something great. And it turns out, and this is a fairly big case in Manchester, that the kids were being babysat, and the babysitter killed the kids, strangled them, and then set the house on fire. And he's in prison or dead for it now. But I'll never forget, we didn't know right away what was going on. The mother was on a date, a first date with somebody, and came, and there was the driveway kind of sloped up to the house, and it was freezing rain, and she had high heels. She was all dressed up for New Year's Eve, and she kept trying to run up the driveway and slipping because of the ice in her high heels, and the firemen were trying to help her. And so it's not so much gruesome things that you remember so much as the just really kind of horrible and vivid things. And one thing about that, I had to keep going. There was a gas station down a couple blocks away. It got too late for me to use a neighbor's phone. I had to keep going down to this payphone on this dark street at this closed gas station and calling updates of the story to another reporter or an editor who would take dictation from me. I don't think it was the next day, until the next day we found out it was a murder, but Paula and I were both suspicious that the police wouldn't let us talk to the man. And it turned out that the kid he had run down to the fire station with had a ligature around her neck. So they knew immediately something was up. I hope people listening aren't finding this all off-putting.
No, that's the life of a journalist.
I'm sure there were some really happy, pleasant stories.
Well, that was kind of what I was going to ask. Anything to kind of balance this? Any happy stories? Any good fortune stories?
Nothing I can think of. No, not after nearly 40 years of journal. Nothing there. I found, it's funny, my job now is a business reporter. I find a lot of, even before the pandemic, a lot of great stories about resilience, people who don't give up during the pandemic. And I'm sure this has kind of become a cliche now, so people don't want to hear about it, but just the way business owners, you yourself are an example, adapted quickly instead of everybody kind of just throwing up their hands and saying, we can't do anything, let's just go under, and found ways to stay in business and to bring their product to people. And there are just so many things. I've probably written more. It's ironic because it's been this awful pandemic, but probably written more stories people can feel good about in the past year and a half than I did in my previous years as a reporter. But I was only a reporter for 10 years. And then I became an editor, I want to say in the mid 90s. And it's just now, the past few years with my current job, that I'm back to actually being a reporter. Although I wrote a column at the Union Leader, and I can't remember what year this is, but it was actually instrumental in finally kicking my butt into being a mystery writer. I wrote a column, I think it was just, I lived on the west side of Manchester, which is a culturally interesting area of the city. I have to tell you guys, a lot of you are New Hampshire people, but, and I could write kind of about whatever I wanted to. And after the first one, I got feedback, emails and stuff from people, even phone calls from people saying how much they liked what I had written. And I was seeing my parents after that, a few days after, and I said to my mom, I forgot how powerful it can be to write something and have people respond to it and touch something in people. And she says, well, I always think of you as a writer. And that made me feel kind of fraudulent and guilty because I hadn't written jack in 20 years, And that's when I said, okay, I have to either fish or cut bait, and I've always wanted to be a mystery writer. I need to get going on that mystery novel. And I think one of the things that had not maybe consciously, but I think one of the reasons I never did, I always rationalize, oh, I'm writing using my writing skills, even though I was an editor, but as a journalist, and but it was always kind of like, I'm going to write that mystery novel. But I think maybe because it had been a dream of mine since I've been a small child, there was a little part of me that said, what if I try it and I can't do it? What if it doesn't happen? What if I somehow disappoint myself, and then I'm like, well, that's ridiculous, because there's maybe I'll write a book that isn't that good, but I know I can sit down and force myself to somehow write a book. And it did take me, I did spin my wheels a little. I accidentally read a book by a very good mystery writer who outlines everything, every chapter, every scene before she writes the book. So I thought I needed to do that. And I had kind of an idea of what I wanted to write about, and a lot of ideas for like themes and characters, not so much plot. And it took me reading Stephen King's On Writing, where his basic message is, sit down and start writing, just write. And I'm like, okay, I'll try his method and not worry about the other. I think it was Elizabeth George, who's a mystery writer, who writes the Thomas Lindley mysteries. And I'm not casting aspersions. It obviously works for her because she's a wildly successful mystery writer. But maybe I was letting that paralyze me. I don't know, but I'm just like, I don't know what my plot's going to be. I kind of know what it might-ish be, but I can't write the book until I know what the plot is. But it turns out that the plot develops as you're writing the book.
Well, definitely going to get to your books here in just a couple minutes. When did you start? Did you start writing before you became a journalist? Did you from a young age, or did you really start your writing when you became a journalist?
I wrote things as like a kid, the family newspaper, where you do a little fake newspaper in the house, and I wrote stories and stuff. And I really did not write. Yeah, in high school, I wrote the papers I was required to write. And then I got to college and realized that I knew nothing about writing papers. And I really can honestly not remember writing any fiction from my early teens until I wrote my first mystery novel. And I know that's not a path I would recommend for people, but I look at it, I was honing my writing muscles. I think not only as a reporter, but even more as an editor, you're always thinking about writing, sentence structure and clarity and telling the story. And so it's not like I went from 0 to whatever the number would be. If I were a numbers person, I would not be writing, I guess. But when I wrote my first book, I think it was always there, kind of. And also I've never been able to find out from people if this is normal or not, but I would as most people in my generation, watch a lot of TV, but I'd go to bed at night and rework the plots. Like, say, one of my favorite shows was the Mod Squad, the original one, not the crappy 90s movie, but I would go lay in bed and rework the plot and get rid of Julie, so I could be the girl with Pete and Link, and I would go over and over and like edit and rework. And to some extent, I still do that. If I'm not in the middle of writing a book, I have these stories going on in my head. I'll be reading a mystery novel and kind of not really like the way it's going. And when I go to bed at night, I'm kind of making up my own version of it. So it's not the same as putting words on paper, but I can't imagine that there's been a night in my life that I haven't done that to some extent. So
Being a journalist, obviously you have to get right to the point of the story, because it's going to be obviously short and it has to fit in a certain section, some obviously bigger than others, but depending on
right.
what page you're on. So it's kind of like writing a short story. You've got especially a short mystery story, which we've interviewed some people who have done short mystery stories like 5,000, 6,000 words. So you really got to get to the point in the mystery right away. Was there anything that helped you, classes or um, writers groups or anything that helped you transition from that journalism writing to writing novels?
Um, it was a difficult transition because I was pretty good at writing a decent news story, but there was nothing flashy or creative about it. It's, the lead is the most important thing, and you go from most important to least important. There aren't any twists. There aren't any plot development. And the it took me, it's such a different kind of writing that it kind of took me a little bit to break free of that. But the most difficult thing is that I I have been so ingrained on whatever people may think of journalists. You don't misquote someone. You don't put something in quotes that somebody didn't say. And it actually took me a little while to think I can make up what people are saying. They can say whatever I want them to say, and I can make it up. And you'd think that'd be a little bit of a stumbling block, not feeling that, but it was. I think because I've also been a very voracious reader my entire life and a big reader of mystery novels, starting when I was a kid, that I understood how they should be written. I understood what I liked and what I didn't like. One book that was a big help. I didn't take any courses. I didn't really have the money or patience for that. But one book that helped me, I think the book that helped me the most is one that was called "Don't Murder Your Mystery" by I want to say her name is Chris Roan or something. And she had been a book mystery novel editor, and it was the top like 25 things, very in depth, about the kind of things that just writing things and other things that just kill a mystery novel. And it was hugely helpful. And before I start a book, I always kind of go back and do a refresher on that, because it's one thing to know what bad writing is. It's another thing to execute good writing. You can know what cliches are, but when you're writing, you're not necessarily thinking of at least the way I write. I'm trying to get the story down, and then I go back and try to fix the language and fix things. So that was helpful. I had a lovely when I was in New Hampshire writing group, and we enjoyed each other's company, but I found it and they had some good suggestions and stuff, but I found that wasn't necessarily a productive way to learn how to be a better writer. And it's nothing to do with the other people in the group. It's just everything's subjective. Good writing, the structure of writing is objective, but you have your own voice, you have your own way of saying things. You need to, and you need to understand yourself what that is, and it can be very distracting to have people want to see things their way in your book, not your way. And it's and I don't want to sound arrogant. I don't mean this in an arrogant way, but I felt like I knew enough about basic writing and what made writing good and bad, both fiction and nonfiction, from my career and my life as a reader, and also listening to writers on TV and everything, that I could kind of feel my own way on it and figure it out for myself. And then I have some very good readers who read my first drafts, who make awesome suggestions, and that helps. But I have never taken a creative writing course or anything like that.
Who were some of your favorite? You mentioned you read mystery books. Who were some of your favorites and most influential mystery writers just growing up and really got you feeling good about writing your own mystery stories?
I would say I went very quickly from children's to adult mystery novels. But as a child, before we moved to Maine, there was a writer, Mary C. Jane, Jane, and I don't know if that was her real name or not. She wrote kids' mysteries that took place in Maine. And there was one mystery on Dead End Farm that took place in Aroostook County, and which I had no idea where it was. And it was dark for a kid's book. And it dealt with topics that as a young kid, I found more interesting than Nancy Drew and people like that. Phyllis Whitney, I remember she had this book, Mystery of the Crimson Ghost, that scared the hell out of me. And those, I think both of those writers made me realize at a young age that you can kind of break out from the standard kind of formula and go a little deeper. Although as a 10-year-old or whatever, I definitely wouldn't have worded it that way. Then when I was 14, and I started reading like Agatha Christie and people like that. And then when I was 14, my sister Liz, who's a year older than me, and I had a big fight. I wanted to watch The Streets of San Francisco, and she wanted to watch Masterpiece Theater. And this was back in the old days when he had one TV. And she somehow won, which wasn't normal, because I was a little bigger than her, even though I was. And we watched Masterpiece Theater, and it was the Lord Peter Wimsey mysteries by Dorothy Sayers. And it opened this world to me, that I went to the library, Lithgow Library in Augusta, Maine, the next day, and it started reading Dorothy Sayers books. And those were the first mystery novels I had read where character was more, not, I won't say more important, but character was a big part of the book. Like Agatha Christie, I know people love her. I find the characters kind of cardboard, superficial. But Dorothy Sayers, her Lord Peter Wimsey had shell shock from World War One, which was just so interesting to me as a kid. I guess it still is as an adult. There's a PTSD theme in my books, but that how he felt and how he dealt with other people and how other people dealt with him and the kind of nuances of human relationships really had an impact on me, to the point where I would say her books were the most influential on me as a writer of any author. Ruth Rendell, I discovered later, and she's written under some other names too, but hers are very psychological. And I think one of the things that makes mysteries interesting to people is people are interested in why people do things, or what, human relationships, and what's more troubling about a human mind than one that makes its body kill somebody. And the mystery writers who didn't just look at it as a plot, but as people interacting with each other and people's feelings and people's behavior, I find more interesting. I can read any genre if the characters are good. I think that's one thing that makes Stephen King's books so good. Not that they're ooh, gory or horrific, but he truly understands people and how they think and feel. If you're a teenager, as many of us started reading him as teenagers, he understands misfits and the kids who aren't the cool kids, the adults who aren't the cool adults. And I think books that get that are good. That those are always the kind of books I've been drawn to.
As a journalist, though, it, especially being first on the scene for like a fire or a body floating in the river or something, you do kind of have that mystery as to who did this, why did this, what made somebody burn this house down. You find out later that kids were killed and other things may have happened in that. So is that also kind of one of the things that maybe influenced you, that you can, instead of just having the situation, you yourself can now answer the questions?
Right, you can, and it's, although journalism, even back in the fun 80s when I started, isn't like it is in my books or on TV. I wasn't out there solving crimes, but it was it was an exercise to figure out who to talk to. um you shouldn't always, this is nothing against the police or other authorities, but don't take their word for things. And I think we've learned, if we've learned nothing else now by 2021, we've learned that what they say happened may not be what happened. And we were always very big back then, and I think things have probably changed now because of staffing and other reasons, of when we covered a crime, we didn't just talk to the police. We knocked on the doors. We called up, or we got the reverse phone book in the office and called people up and said, "Did you see what happened? Do you know what happened? Do you know this person? Do you know this person? Do you know?" And yeah, it's not the same as solving a crime, but it's trying to understand more what happened than just what you're being told, and being the person who can, having that responsibility to let people know what really happened, or everybody can just go read the police report, and why have journalists at all? So in that case, trying to figure out who to talk to and what they would have to offer, and what was important and what wasn't, what to follow up on. I'll say one thing at the Union Leader, for instance, that since I was a night breaking news reporter, that was the only night I covered that story. Then it went on to other people. One reporter, Nancy West, did most of the work on that. She was a very good crime reporter and really a bulldog. And so at that newspaper, we were big enough and had a big enough staff that somebody in my position didn't really get to follow. I was at the scene, but I wasn't the one doing the court cases and as the crime wound its way. But you're there in the newsroom with the people who are, and you're talking about it, and it's a lot of fun, or was a lot of fun to just talk it out with people, speculate on what happened, and I think that helped everybody figure out how to cover the story better too.
So you have 3 books. Bad, yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to say all the names.
Cold hard news, no news is bad news, and bad news travels fast. So let's start with the first one. Cold hard news. When the snow in a small Maine town starts to melt, the town's secret begins to emerge. Bernie O'Day, the editor of the Peaks Weekly Watcher, is jazzed to finally have a big story to cover when a body is found in a melting snowbank. But as spring turns into a long, hot, explosive summer in Redmere, Maine, the story gets bigger, maybe too big for Bernie to handle. So Redmere, if I'm saying it right, Maine, and Franklin County, Maine, that was another place I found that your books take place in Franklin County. Are those real towns, or are they made up towns?
Franklin County is a real place. It is northwest of where I live. It's in the western mountains of New Hampshire. People would probably be most familiar with Rangeley Lakes area.
Okay.
The town is fake. As a reader, I always found fake towns frustrating and would try to figure out where they were, and the geography was always messed up. But as a writer, it's much easier to write a book when your town is fake and you can put things where you want and put the people in it when you want, and people think a little less that you're basing people on them, although they still think you're basing people on them. And I actually, when I started writing that book, it was in Waldo County, which is east of Augusta toward the coast. And I realized as I was going through revisions, I had read a lot of Jerry Boyle books, and I don't know if people are familiar with him, but he's a Maine writer who has a newspaper theme, and I always enjoyed reading his books, and then I got to know him, and he's a great guy. But this was before I knew him well, but I realized that my fake town in Waldo County was exactly where his fake town was. And I'm like, well, we can't have that. And I had just moved back to Maine. This was 10 years ago. And I had been driving around for my job at the newspaper where I worked here. I wanted to refamiliarize myself with the area. I had grown up in Augusta. So I was driving around and I found Franklin County very interesting and kind of underserved in the mystery world. I didn't want to have something on the coast. I didn't want to have lobsters and lighthouses and an old guy saying Aya, not that there's anything wrong with those books, but I also like the fact that it's more remote. There are areas where you can't get cell service, and remoteness and being cut off, it make for better mysteries because, if everybody can just take out their cell phone and call for help and stuff. So Franklin County is real, and I try to, in my books, get the setting. So if you're from there, you're not like all annoyed that I'm not getting it right. And if you haven't been there, you can get a feel for what it's like. I think the setting is very important. And I find it with the mountains and the remoteness and the very small towns that are far apart. It's perfect for mysteries. So,
Now, do all three books are they all set in Redemere, or are there different towns for each one?
Yeah, they're all set in Redemere. Bernie O'Day, she is the owner and editor of a weekly newspaper in Redemere. And if anybody's familiar with Franklin County, Redemere is kind of in the Phillips, Strong, Kingfield area. It's kind of up there. Well, everything is set in the town. There's only so many people you can kill. So like the second book has these flashback scenes to when the police chief was in Philadelphia before he came there. And that was kind of because I started writing one book and then wanted to write another, and then thought it sounds awful, but it's actually not that bad a book. I thought maybe I should combine these and see what happens. And I think it worked out. And then the third book takes place in the town, but also there's some stuff happens on the Appalachian Trail, which is north of the town by a couple towns. I was inspired by a lot of the stuff in my books is I'm not based on real life, but inspired by, for instance, in my first book, there was, I'm sure people from New Hampshire may remember the Lee Kenny, Bruce McKay shooting in Franconia in 2007, where Lee Kenny shot the police officer, Bruce McKay, but it wasn't as there were complications to the whole story, and there were things about it that bothered me. So part of Cold Hard News was kind of saying, okay, I'm going to take this thing that kind of bothers me and make it my story and work it out so that maybe some of what bothers me can be dissipated and not be causing me angst. And actually a lot of writings like that. You can work things out. There's a scene in I think my second book. I won't go into the gruesome detail, but there's an incident where some ducks on the road get run over. And I was driving to work one day in Augusta, and that happened. pretty much like I describe it in the scene. And I won't go into it. But I didn't enjoy seeing that. It was bothering me and I couldn't get it out of my head. So I'm like, I have to put it in my book and I can take it out of my head and put it in the book I'm writing right now. And then it won't bother me as much. And it worked.
Did you take some of the? Did you do that with some of the more gruesome scenes as a journalist, and use those sort of real life stories in your book to try to, I guess, maybe sort of cathartic, I guess, just
Yeah,
trying to get it out, and so that you use those stories in your book?
I would say not gruesome, although the duck thing was a little gruesome. But more things that bothered me, things that bother me emotionally, or people's reactions to them, or um, my third book is kind of based on a few things. There was a woman, God, it's hard to believe how much time goes by. In 2013, she got lost on the Appalachian Trail up here, Geraldine Largay, and they ended up finding her remains. There was a big search, and they ended up finding her remains a couple of years later. There was a couple of years after that, a guy who had shot his ex-girlfriend, and he was running around in the woods all summer. And he finally got tired of getting bit by mosquitoes, and they brought him in. And then we had the case of the quote unquote North Pond hermit here in the Augusta area, where this guy had just walked away from home and lived in the woods for 27 years and was stealing from people's camps and stuff, and was finally arrested. He was caught on surveillance a couple times. It's a pretty interesting story. It has been misrepresented in some books by national writers who don't live in Maine, but it bothered me that he had become this caricature. The North Pond Hermit, the paper I worked for at the time, coined it. But he had a name, he has a name, and he didn't choose to be a cartoon character. And so all those things were kind of in my head when I started my third book. And it's not that they were necessarily gruesome, but they were all things that were taking up a lot of place in my head, in bothersome, that they bothered me. There were things about them, about human suffering and misunderstanding and stuff that bothered me. And I thought, okay, how can I make a book using these things that isn't just some horrible mishmash? I remember trying to describe it to my publisher when I first started, and she was like, "Yeah," and I'm like, "No, don't worry, it's going to be awesome," But I think it's more, not so much gruesome things. I guess I have a pretty solid stomach as far as gruesome stuff goes. It's more kind of emotional harm type things that are, I find, more bothersome, if that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. When you're ready, so you have all these ideas and emotions and stuff in your head, you're ready to get them out into a new book. How do you start? Do you write them all down in like a notebook or on Scribner or whatever, and then start and then do an outline from that, or do you just start throwing things on paper and then mixing it up as sort of an editing process type thing?
It's not a pretty process. The reason I grimaced when you mentioned Scribner is I tried to use that, and I think it set me back about 3 or 4 months getting my second book written, and I just said screw it, and I had this post-it notes on a whiteboard system instead that worked better for me. But what I do is I try to get an idea of how I'm going to start and where I'm going to go, and usually it's more thematic with some plot stuff in mind. The beginning can sometimes change, but the important thing to me is just to start writing. And then when I go, it's like, just like Stephen King describes it, it's like priming this pump. And when I'm going good, I have legal pads all over my house, because I've realized I'm not going to remember this thing. like I think of a great piece of dialogue or a plot thing, or a scene, and then I have to write it. I'll get up, I have one in my bedroom, and at 3 a.m, I say I have to write this down because I'm not going to remember it. And I've learned to put on my glasses and turn a light on, or I'm not going to be able to read it in the morning either. So, and as far as outlining goes, what I tend to do is when I'm into it more, then I start outlining where I am. Well, I don't use the Post-it notes. You can buy a big whiteboard panel at Lowe's for like $9.99, and it's like 3x4, I think, or something like that. And so I use different colored dry erase markers for different, my previous books, points of view. The one I'm writing now is first person, but the other ones I have third person with a couple points of view. So I would do that, and I would outline each scene, because the biggest thing is, especially with a mystery, you lose track of who knows what, when, or what happens, or where the clue was. So I have all these like multiple outlines, and then I go back and redo stuff, and then go forward, and then change the outline, and write notes to myself, and just write outlines on pieces of paper that I throw away the next day. And what I've learned over 3 books is the most important thing is to get the story down, and to not worry first time around about the writing. I know people speak in drafts, like first draft and second draft. I find I end up doing many revisions, because as hard as it is not to worry about the writing, I want to get the story down and not get caught up on trying to make some sentence perfect or some scene. And sometimes I'll just put in like brackets. This is the scene where she finds the thing, and the following scene's kind of in my head. So I move on, and I can go back, and I usually end up with maybe 20,000 words more than the book will be when it's finished, because like I know as I'm doing it, all this exposition, all this background, this stupid dialogue that's not going anywhere and stuff is all going to come out, but I need to put it down to move the story ahead of my head. And then when I go back and revise it, I know what to take out, but I rarely throw things away. What I do is when I cut things out, I'll put them in different pages, files in my computer, so I can go back and make sure I didn't want it towards the end. I know it sounds exhausting, but and then when I do revisions, I try to, when I think I have a decent draft, then I go through, I'll go through for like spelling and punctuation. I'll go through for setting, make sure the setting is how I want it. I'll go through for dialogue, all sorts of different things, because when you're thinking of one thing, like how this plot is working or whatever, you're not necessarily thinking of, wait, it's 30 degrees out. Why aren't they cold? Kind of thing, and so it takes a lot of, and I'm kind of outlining as I'm doing all that. It's a process.
I spoke to one of the authors a few days ago, and he would put sticky notes on. He'd use a big whiteboard and put sticky notes and stuff. And I asked him, I said, do you have like all lines, string going from different point to different point, like on a police thing? Do you do that on your different sections in your whiteboard, and have this big spider web thing going?
I do have some arrows and stuff, but I did the sticky notes for my second book, particularly because there were flashback scenes. And so I wanted to have in my head where everything was. It was a second layer to who knows what when. And so I had different colors. I had yellow lined sticky notes for those scenes, and then different colors for the points of view. And I had them all stuck on this big board, but the problem is it was winter and my house was dry, and also I had cats, and I may have still had dogs at the time, and I was finding sticky notes all over the house and not where they were supposed to be, and then they dry out after a while and fall off, and that's why I went with the dry erase pens on the whiteboard panel. But yeah, I do have a lot of arrows, and then it because this relates to this, and then it gets to the point where I have to say, okay, I need to redo all this because it's too much of a mess. And yeah, and I'm trying a Scrivener type thing that's simpler, dabble with the book I'm writing now, but I don't know. I think it's probably great for some people. The problem is I find more it's just spending too much time figuring out the workings or how, whether it's working the way I want it to, and then just writing. And I may go back to just a Microsoft doc where I put things in that I can find so I know where things are, and then just obsessive constant outlining.
So let's talk about your main character there, Bernie O'Day. First, how'd you come up with the name?
Well, her name's Bernadette, and I wanted to have I don't know, kind of it's hard to come up with names, but I wanted to have kind of like an elegant old-fashioned name that people just take and mash into a name that isn't that at all. And I can't remember why now that was, and she had a longer Irishy last name, and the publisher wanted a shorter name because pages cost money, and every word counts. And so I looked. My Irish ancestors are from County Clare, so I looked up on the internet, on the World Wide Web, County Clare last names, and picked a short one. So it's not. I know that's not very exciting, but it's very hard to get names. You don't want to have names that sound like other names. I'm conscious of not having names of people I know, because I don't want people to think that the character is named after them, or I'm basing a character on them, or it becomes very difficult. I go to cemeteries in the area where my books take place. The one I'm writing now takes place in a different county of Maine, equally remote, but it is everywhere in the US. There are names, ethnic type names, and other names that are unique, not unique, but you have more of them in one area than another. Like, we have a lot of French Canadian names in Manchester and Dover, in Augusta, where I grew up and stuff. So that's one way I get names. I go to cemeteries in the areas where my book takes place, but I don't take the person's full name. I write down a lot of last names. I write down some first names, and I don't want to name anyone after a real person, especially if they're bad, a murderer or something. So
That's the one thing that I guess kind of irritates me when I'm reading, is when the names sound too similar. Forget who everybody is, especially where lately, well, since I opened the store, I do a lot of audiobooks because we partner with Libro FM for audiobooks, and they send us some free ones to listen to promote and things like that. And especially when I'm half working, half listening, trying to listen to the book to see if it's something we're going to get in the store. But like, okay, there's James, John, Jonah,
right.
Justin, and Jenny. Okay, Jenny's the obvious one, but who are the other ones? And what do they do? Who's the old one? Who's the friend? Who's the brother? That type of thing. But then on the other hand are ones that are like 20 letters long.
Right.
I get it if it's a ethnic name, because it goes along with that character in the story. But if it's all these weird letters put together in consonants, it just
right. So it's like you're hitting a roadblock every time you come to the name. You're like,
right.
Yeah. Exactly. I try to it's very hard, harder than you'd think, to come up with names that aren't alike. And there were two policemen, Ray and Rusty, and but I had them. I don't want to give away if anybody's actually going to read one of my books. And there's a reason their names are similar, because somebody gets them confused in I think the second book. And and so I did that kind of on purpose. But otherwise, it's really hard to, and you don't want to have just generic names. You don't want everybody to have some really, Bob Jones and Susie Smith, and because then that's not like real life. That's not like where you live or where I live. You want to have names that show some diversity of the population.
So Bernie, did you have a picture of what she was going to look like, or her personality was, when you were ready to, before you wrote her? Obviously, it may have changed as you were writing her character and developing her character, but was she modeled after somebody, or was it just sort of a mishmash of people you just see out in public?
Well, a lot of people think that she's similar to me. And I will say, I would say in a lot of characters if you're a writer, have elements of yourself in them. But I wanted to have a female protagonist. I can't remember what I was reading at the time, but I was tired of female protagonists who are really like glamorous and beautiful, and they can shoot guns and cure cancer and do math problems and all this stuff. I wanted to have something more normal and relatable. And so she is not me, but she's somebody who I definitely have some things in common with, and she does things I wouldn't do. And she's developed into, I think, it's, unless you're writing, I think people don't understand that characters aren't this person or that person. They're not based on, like, some characters are based on somebody, but they're actually their own people. They're full-blown people in my head doing their things. And so yeah, she has things that are in common with me, but she has things that are unique to herself. That she is, the goal was to have somebody who people would like, hopefully, but who wasn't this glamorous, superwoman type person, but more of a normal, relatable person that makes mistakes and doesn't pay a lot of attention to her appearance because she's got bigger things going on and that kind of thing.
Do you have other characters in your book that you were really happy the way they came out, either major or minor characters? And then, of course, there's probably characters that are just sort of one-offs,
Yeah.
or you expected them to be one-offs,
Yeah.
but your friends, the readers, your fans, said, "Oh, bring that character back. That was such a great character," when it was just supposed to be just a couple lines in the book, or a couple chapters or whatever in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say the biggest character who I had no plans for, who kind of took over, is Donna, the police sergeant. It's a very small police department, and she's a young woman who people underestimate, and she kind of arrived in the first book. I needed her to be there. But she wasn't a major character. But by the second book, she had become one. And if I ever get to the fourth book, the book I'm writing now isn't part of the series, but once I'm done with this, I'm going to hopefully write the fourth book of the series. She's got a big part to play coming up. But she turned out, she's just, I know people don't believe this when writers say this, but I didn't sit down and say, here's what Donna's going to be like, and she's going to do this and she's going to do that. And she emerged herself, and when you're really into writing, you start writing scenes you didn't realize you were going to write and stuff. And she really became, and I would say she's probably the most upright and dependable person in the books. And if you had asked me 10 years ago when I started writing that first book, I would have said, what? I'm not even sure who you're talking about, And so definitely I think she's the character I'm most I know I can count on to be the guiding star, you know.
Have you ever gotten flack from anybody that you killed off a really prominent character and people were like really upset about that?
Not yet, but I think it's because I haven't killed off anybody. I'm trying to think. I haven't. No. And this is a spoiler, and it may make people want to read my books less, but I can absolutely guarantee that my lead characters, Bernie and Pete, the police chief, who was not gonna he definitely wasn't gonna be like this co-protagonist, but he became one. They will not be killed. They will not die in any of my books. I think that you know, everybody has their reasons for writing the way they do, but I can think of no good reason to kill off major characters. And for me, for my own books, for my own writing, to kill off major characters who people like. You know, there's plenty of people to kill.
Is there one that you plotted out knowing that this particular character was gonna die at some point, but you just loved the way you wrote the character, just from either the details of how they look to the dialogue, which is fantastic, and then when you got to that point where they had to die, it kind of upset you that you maybe there's a way I can keep this character. No, no, this
No,
person
no,
has to
no.
go.
I know. I don't know everyone who's gonna die. They, but I pretty much have an idea who's gonna die, and I'm cool with it. You know, because I can control it. I can control what's going on in my head to some extent. That they none of them deserved it, but they, you know, I'm basically the one who's killed them, so I have to be okay with that. I'm the god of the books. The and I sometimes people will ask me, oh, if I make you mad, are you gonna kill me? You know, in one of your books, ha ha ha. And I'm like, no, because the people who are killed in my books, even if they're not wonderful people, even if they're bad people, they're victims who you need to feel bad for. When people who make me angry or I have some issue with that I need to work out end up being either murderers or jerks in my book. I make them characters that nobody's going to like. And I know people say, you know, every character needs some redeeming qualities. Well, you know what? They don't all need them. And so if people piss me off, that's what happens to them in my books. They don't get killed. They get made to look, but you know, I'm sure they won't recognize themselves.
So when it comes to killing somebody off, or how graphic do you get? Do you write it out and then say, you know what, I think I can go a little bit further, or you know what, that's a little too much, I'm going to back off on this particular thing?
My books are not cozy mysteries, which is, you know, don't have the
Right.
graphic stuff on the page, but they're also not just really gory hardcore. And that's a choice because again, with the gore and stuff, I don't find any benefit to it. I don't find it emotionally productive, if that's, yeah, I'm more interested in you know what, the horror of behavior and stuff. So there is, and that's not to say there isn't some gory stuff. There people have taken issue with, and I think it's kind of funny because there's so much gross and disgusting stuff in books and on TV and stuff. But my second book, it has a hunting theme, and I don't hunt myself, but I have a friend who I may tell me about, if you're going hunting, every detail from when you start, what you're packing, what you're thinking, blah blah blah. And somebody in the book, and this happens early on, so it's not a spoiler, is when you shoot a deer, you gut the deer. So this happened to a person, and you leave the pile of innards
Entrails. Yeah.
there for the crows to eat or whatever. And I didn't do that to be gross. I did it to have people in the book have something horrible to react to, if people can understand that distinction. And for obviously some horrible thing to have happened to this person. And I think that's the one thing that I've gotten more negative feedback on than anything else. And I'm like, well, my books, and also my third book is something fairly, I don't know if the word's grisly, but the police chief is in the woods and suffers an injury, and is trapped there. And a lot of people found that much more, what happened to him, much more grisly than I did. And maybe it's because I was writing it, and I did it for reasons that I needed him to be not be able to move and to be stuck, and for somebody to have to come and help him out. And that's the way I thought it. And it's funny, at the time I had a problem with my arm and was going to an orthopedic doctor, and I quizzed him about this particular injury, and he had a great time discussing it with me and all the but again, people are like, oh, that's that's so, and I'm like, there's a lot worse things. I don't have bullets going in slow motion through people's heads with brain matter flying all over the place or anything. I don't describe the couple, God, it's funny, it's hard to remember, but the shootings in my books are not graphically described. Most of the murders, in none of the murders do you see happen. Does the reader see happen? And that's not out of sensitivity. It's just that I felt the way I wanted to tell the story didn't make it necessary for you to see it happen,
Mhm. So when you are editing the story, and you get to some of those technical parts, so you went and talked to a doctor, you went and you have a friend who hunts, and you got some input as to how to write it, and so you wrote it out. Do you kind of go back to them and say, will you read this? So a beta reader, but do you have beta readers who just read the story as a story, and do you have like technical beta readers to check over those parts that have a more technical aspect to it?
That's a good question. The friend who hunts, I had him read the book anyway. And it's funny because he's an articulate person who expresses himself well. That I know that's redundant. And a lot of the words in that, like the first scene of that book where the guy is out hunting and how he feels and what he hears and stuff are Scott's, my friend, are his words. So and he read it, and I think he had some suggestions that I went with. I have a sister, my youngest sister is a physical therapist, and is very schooled in medical stuff. She's not, she's got some position that at Elliott Hospital in Manchester, and I can never remember what her title is, so she's probably not watching this, but I have her read the medical stuff, and and I tell her, this isn't a documentary, and there are some things that I have to have happen that may not, but I don't want it to be beyond the realm of. So I have her sign off on any medical stuff I have. I have a brother who's a lawyer. He doesn't really practice now, but he's very nitpicky about law stuff, so I don't have him read it. And then I have two other of my sisters and a writer friend and another friend. I've narrowed it down. Like my first book, I had way too many people read and got way too much useless. I appreciate them all reading it, and some things were good, but too much feedback. But those four people, I have them read not for typos or sentence structure, but for, is the plot working? are the characters, is it making sense how it happens? Are there any big holes and stuff like that? And then I have somebody who read my first book and found some typos, who lives in the area, who's a high school principal, I think, who volunteered to read. He's read my past 2 books just for spelling and typos and stuff like that. And I should have a professional editor go through it before I send it to my publisher. But I just haven't had the time, but it's something I highly recommend to people to get a real. I was a judge in the Writer's Digest self-published contest for many years, and have probably read more than 600 self-published books for that contest. And the number one thing that almost every single book needed was an editor. And he may, the retired English teacher next door, or your husband who knows his grammar or whatever, that's great to have them read it, but you need to shell out the money for a professional editor. And I don't do it anymore, so I'm not like plugging myself here, because there are just things that people, especially things like point of view shifts and plot strings that don't get picked up, the things that professional book editors know to look for and are good at finding. And I'm lucky enough to have readers who do that. And my publisher had good editors. But if anybody's listening who is a first-time writer who's looking to pitch their book, I would say get it professionally edited and pay the editor what their work is worth.
Well, it's it's nice to have family and friends read your book, because you want the input and stuff, but it's an editor's an unbiased opinion who's just gonna tell you like it is, instead of, yeah, that was a great book, I really enjoyed it, when there's tons of problems with it. We've had some come to us and say, here, will you read the book so that I'd like you to put my book on your shelf. Well, let me read it first. And I go and I look at reviews and stuff, and it's reviews from friends and family and stuff, or they even tell me that, oh yeah, my friends and family have reviewed it and they give me 5
my mom
stars
thinks
on
it's great.
yeah. And it's like, well, was it professionally edited or reviewed? And
Right.
no. I'm like, okay, well, it's good to have that unbiased
Yeah.
opinion.
And I'm lucky, my 4 like Maine readers are all very good at telling me what's wrong with it, and I've gotten so much valuable feedback from them. And so when you do have people read it, I mean, it's great to have, and 2 of them are my sisters, but they're not shy about talking to me about how it can be better. I would say people want to have somebody read it, but you want to have people who are knowledgeable about reading and writing read it. You don't want to have someone who is gonna tell you how good it is. There are lots of people who can tell you how good it is. When I was writing my first book, I had sent 100 or so pages to one of my sisters, because I had no clue if I was doing anything good or not. And my mom heard us talking about it at Thanksgiving, and she's like, "Oh, I want to read it." And I'm like, "Oh, it's not even a first draft, Mom, and oh, I want to read it." So I said, "Okay, I'll let you read it, but you have to give me critical feedback. You have to tell me what you really think about it." And so I got an email from her a couple days later saying, "Oh, I know you wanted me to give you critical feedback, but I just think it's wonderful, and you're such a wonderful writer. I love you, Mom." And I'm like, "Oh," like, well, yeah, I guess everybody needs one of those, but you need a lot more of the other,
Right.
of the other side.
Well, it's good for encouragement to keep you going, to keep
but
your
she's my mom,
enthusiasm going. But right, as long as you can kind of
what's she gonna
separate,
say?
right, as long as you can separate that part from, so you have a publisher. What made you decide to go with a publisher versus independent publishing?
Well, and this is, this is no knock on anybody who goes with independent publishing, but there are millions of books self-published a year, And it's really hard to get recognized, no matter how good your book may be. You know, everybody hears this story, you know, 50 Shades of Grey or whatever, you know, those are few and far between. And a traditional publisher can do more for you than you can do for yourself. But also the basic thing is, I wanted to have somebody say, um, this is good enough that I'm going to put my resources and money behind it and put it out there for you. And that's what a publisher is saying, that I'm backing you up and getting your book out there because you're good enough for me to do that. And I'm not saying that, I mean, there are a lot of good indie published books. There are a lot that look professional. I can tell you from being a judge in that contest that most aren't. And that's not to be snotty about it, but most of them are first drafts. People don't understand just the basics of writing in a lot of ways. And your book, no matter how good it is or how well edited or whatever, if you independent publish, is going to be in that mix with all those other ones. And I know there are avenues for independent published books to get out there, but I wanted somebody to say, yeah, this is good enough. This is good enough for me to put my resources behind it and put it out there. And as a bookseller, you know, that if your book is traditionally published, it's a hell of a lot easier to get it into a bookstore and get it on bookshelves. And, you know, and I'm not, obviously I love to write and I would love to do it all the time. But I would also, you know, want people to buy it. You know, you're not just writing it so your mom can read it and your 50 friends who are going to buy it on Amazon. And then when you run out of them, nobody else sees it. You know, I want people, you know, I got an email one night from somebody in British Columbia who said, I hate you because I stayed up all night reading your book. You know, you want that kind of thing to happen. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen with indie publish, but I felt like I want to do this. I would like to be able to do this at a level where I don't, right now I have one full-time job and 2 part-time jobs aside from writing. I'd like to maybe cut out the full-time job and just do the part-time jobs and have my writing support me. I don't live a lavish lifestyle. I'm, you know, I don't have to have some big mansion. Don't need to be on the New York Times bestseller list, but to the level I'd like to get to, I can't be an indie published writer and get to that level. I think very few indie published writers get there. So
when so one of the things that I've heard having a publisher helps with is, of course, marketing, but you also have to do your portion of the marketing yourself. Now, of course, pandemic aside, did you go to well, let's just say pre-pandemic, did you used to go and hawk your wares at conventions? You know, you set up a booth and you have your
yeah.
books and you talk to things. What are some of the typical questions that you would get from people who stop by your booth about your books
Well, the one
or
I
yourself?
said earlier, about, haha, you know, if I make you mad, will you murder me? Not in the book, but my least favorite, well, not my least favorite, but the one people get an answer they don't like to is, who would play your characters in a movie? Now, was that something you were going to ask me?
No, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
And my answer always is to that. My characters are unique human beings on their own. They don't look like, you know, it's not like George Clooney and Sophia Loren are going to play them. You know, I deliberately, it's funny how detailed pictures people have of my characters, because I deliberately don't do a lot of describing. I have very few places in my book where you're going to get one of those blocks of description of people. I try to use a very light brush, because I think people's imaginations are very powerful, and people have their own idea of what the characters look like. And I think everybody has a little different idea. And if I were to pick out who would play them in a movie, it would mess up people's pictures of who my characters are. So usually when people ask me that, I say, well, I think the bigger question is, who would you have play them in a movie? I mean,
Who are some of the most famous or sort of where you were starstruck conventions that you've been at, and you got to meet somebody, be it Stephen King or Lee Childs or something like that, and you were just so starstruck that this person's talking to me?
Yeah. I go every year except for last year because I didn't have it. The New England Crime Bake, which takes place in Massachusetts and is a really cool convention. It's small, about 250 people, and so the it doesn't have that's the only one I really go to. I can't afford to go to all these big ones people go to. But Anne Cleves, who's a British writer, she writes the Shetland series and the Vera series. She was the guest the last time it was held live, so that must have been 2019. And I bought a couple of her books, and I went up to get them autographed. And I had something clever to say. I can't remember what it was, but my mind just went blank, and I didn't say whatever it was at all. And a similar thing happened. I'm a huge fan of Dennis Lehane, who writes. He's a Boston writer. I don't think he lives there anymore, but he wrote, for instance, the movie Shutter Island is based on Mystic River. And I love his writing style, and I've always been a big fan. And a very similar thing happened. He was at that convention a while ago, several years ago, and he said something on a panel that I really identified with and thought was great. And so I had my books, and I was gonna like kind of bond with him over the thing he had said. And again, I just didn't say it. I just because it's like your one chance to talk to this person, and you don't want them to think, who is this asshole talking to me? I mean, what's wrong with this person? And you figure there's this line of 1,000 people, so it's not like there's going to be any benefit to him for me saying something clever, or that's what was going through my head, I think. But it's funny, they are just regular people though when you talk to them, and I always think it's funny when people are to me like, oh, you're the writer, oh wow, it's so great, and I'm like kind of like, oh yeah, but I'm very lucky in Maine. We have a very active and tight-knit mystery writing community in Maine, and people know each other, and it's just a great community to be part of. And I would say too, to anyone, no matter where you live, if you're looking to write, to look for small local conventions and writing gatherings, not necessarily writer groups, but gatherings or associations for writers where you can meet people and become part of a community. It's really beneficial. And I think when I went to my first Crime Bake, I was working in the newsroom at the Union Leader, and people are very cynical. Oh, everybody's writing a book, nobody ever gets a book published and all this. And I didn't know anybody else who was writing a mystery. And I went to the Crime Bake, I think it was 2008 was my first one, and all of a sudden there's 250 people who are either writing books or are huge mystery fans, and you can talk to them. Harlan Coben was the guest of honor that year, and I chatted with him a little. I'd had a couple beers, so I wasn't as starstruck as I should have been. And realizing that there are other people who are doing it, people who can identify with you and talk about writing and stuff, is a huge benefit. Yeah, it's something I've missed this past year because we haven't had, it's, you don't want to Zoom up with somebody, but I mean, things like this are great, but is just chatting, meeting somebody in a bar and after an event and having a drink and talking and stuff is, when they're a writer too, is a huge benefit to, you know.
One big organization that I believe you're a part of and that we've worked with quite a few times is Sisters in Crime,
Yeah, they're
Sisters in
great.
Crime New England, and I believe that's how we met.
Yes.
It was through them, through one of their panels, and so I'm just waiting for Leslie Wheeler to get back with me with some panels, and hopefully we only will have to do 2 of them on Zoom, and we can do maybe the third one late summer in person, but we'll plan all
That'd be
3
great.
on Zoom and stuff. So yeah, definitely. There's a lot of writers groups out there. There's Mystery Writers of America. There's
Yeah. And
the
for
Guppies.
sisters, yeah, and sisters in crime, you do not have to be a published writer or even a woman to
Right.
join it. That you can be somebody who's looking to write, looking to learn how to write. You can be male, female, and it's a great group with lots of events and resources for people. And it's cheap. The New England chapter, I think, is $25 a year. And I think the national chapter is maybe 40, maybe it's gone up to 50. So it's not that expensive. And it's just, especially if you're looking to get some traction with your writing and stuff, it's a great organization.
Well, we are at the end of the time,
Mm,
and one thing we will be looking for is your next book.
mm.
Either the next book in the
Me too.
series, the one the one you're writing now, and of course the next Bernie O'Day
Bernie.
book. So for now, though, you can, like I said at the beginning, you can get all 3 books, signed copies, in the store. Come on in, we'll get you hooked up, or you can go online, just search on New England Books, New England Writers section on our website, and Maureen's pictures right there under the main writers section. I have everybody listed by states, and
Oh,
it says mystery writer underneath it. Click on that, brings up your page and your books. Click on those, and you can come in and pick it up, or we can ship it to you. It's also available through one of them's bookshop is available through bookshop.org. Your audiobook is available on that company who shall not be named, and hopefully at some point on Libro FM, so we can go ahead and do it. But also definitely ask if it's not at your local bookstore, ask your local bookseller, and I'm sure that they can find a way to get it. Maureen, thank you very much for being a part of our thing, and we hope to see you in person, or at least on another
I
Zoom
hope to see
panel
you
with
too.
Sisters in Crime.
And Chris, thanks for having me, and thanks for keeping books and book selling alive during the pandemic. You're doing a great job, and I appreciate you having events like this and finding ways to sell books. And I'm hoping everybody flocks to your store.
We're all surviving, and we're going to continue growing. So thank you again.
Great. Well, it was great talking to you.